because there's another session starting, so I'll just start now. So my name is Andrés Knobel. I'm a lawyer from Argentina. I'm a consultant at Tax Justice Network, which is an international network of researchers and analysts, including economists and lawyers and journalists from all over the world, and we deal basically with analyzing and doing research on issues about financial transparency, tax evasion, and, well, with a very big focus on tax havens and secrecy jurisdictions, as I'll explain later. And the idea today, I was asked whether I could just show the comparison of different tax havens or different secrecy jurisdictions in terms of many different issues, such as bank secrecy, corporate transparency, just also for companies and trusts and partnerships. So the idea is just to go along all that line, but that will be at the end. At the beginning, I would just like to start by explaining what the Financial Secrecy Index is, this research project I have been working on together with two other colleagues. And, well, I'll just to get started. So the idea today is first to analyze the FSI, so the Financial Secrecy Index, objectives and the structure, just analyzing why we go ahead with this project, then analyzing the results and the political context, which will explain the differences between the FSI together with other indexes, and then in the end just go to the secrecy detailed assessments and comparison between the different jurisdictions. So to start, why the FSI? So why the Financial Secrecy Index, and why this research? Well, as the Economist cover over there shows about the missing 20 trillion, there's this huge issue about the illicit financial flows of money. So it's money coming from corruption, money laundering, finance of terrorism, capital flight, tax evasion, tax avoidance, and drug smuggling, just among many others, which ends up in many of these tax havens or their financial centers of all these tax havens in many countries. And this has a huge impact, first on inequality, because of, obviously, if it's tax evasion, some people are just not paying as much tax as they should, and that usually the burden is on those who less have, so it's usually the lower and middle class, especially working class people. And that also has a consequence in terms of governments who lack the sufficient resources, so that entails public spending cuts, so cuts on human rights, just such as infrastructure spending, making sure and guaranteeing health and security for many of these countries. Just as an example, as I said, I'm from Argentina. There was just very recently a report about Argentinians holding about $200 billion offshore. So that's $200 billion, which obviously is not paying taxes. And again, it's not really the problem. The only problem is about tax evasion. And just in case you read the news about Argentina, our country is really going through really hard times. But it's also about many of these funds are just originated by corruption and involve many of the politicians and many of the people in government. And that's why this is such an important issue worldwide. And now, why specifically the FSI, the Financial Secrecy Index, as opposed to other ones? Well, the main reason is that there is no consistent definition or even identification of tax havens. This graph is just an example. There were about 91 jurisdictions that are part of 11 different lists of tax havens or of these secrecy jurisdictions. Now, the logical thing would be that all these 11 lists would have the very same amount and even identity of the tax havens. But as you can see from the graph, that's obviously not the case. So some of them appear in all of them, in all the 11, only 7 of them actually appear in all of the 11 lists. But in many other cases, there's just different ones appearing in different lists. And the consequence of this is that precisely just being unable to identify and even name those, it then just makes it very complicated to address them and tackle the issue effectively in a way to stop these tax havens and these illicit financial flows and actually get more transparency. So how does the FSI compare to other lists? And, well, so we have most of tax havens list and then the FSI on the right. So the first issue is about clarifying the real issue. So for most tax havens, lists, they issue are tax haven. Actually, they refer to as tax havens jurisdictions. In our case, we would rather use the term secrecy jurisdiction. And the reason for this is that while tax havens focus on tax, basically jurisdictions which have very low tax or no tax whatsoever, whereas we focus on jurisdictions that provide secrecy. That was just one of the comments of the session yesterday. And the importance of secrecy, which is not only, again, for tax evasion, but then for many other crimes, such as money laundering and corruption, which what they need is it's not really about not paying taxes on those monies, but it's basically no one finding out about the existence of these funds and how they were originated. So again, one of the issues about this is that while most tax havens lists identify the traditional small plant islands, many of them in the Caribbean, I guess many from jurisdictions of people who are here, us, on the other hand, focus basically on not only these small plant islands, but also many of the OECD countries as well. So many of the major jurisdictions, the US, the UK, Switzerland, many others that you will see just in a few minutes, those are the ones that we address and we focus and we identify as being the major responsibles in this whole system of illicit financial flows. So while most tax havens lists are in a way a blacklist or whitelist, so you're either in the tax havens list, so that's a blacklist, and if you're not, then that means that you're just completely clear and everything is fine with you. Whereas what we do is we find there's a spectrum. So what we try to do is we cover as many jurisdictions as possible. It's a matter of resources, but the idea is to cover all the jurisdictions in the world. So, well, again, most tax lists say you're either in or out. What we say is, okay, there's this spectrum of transparency or secrecy, and every jurisdiction is somewhere within this line. So that's why. It's not a binary as a yes, no. It's more of a degree. And there is a degree, as you will see later. It's not, we have a degree at this FSI value, so just a ranking of all jurisdictions, but then you can also go specifically in terms of very specific issues, such as what's the ranking in terms of bank secrecy? What's the ranking in terms of corporate transparency? And in that way, just understand how each jurisdiction falls within this. And the importance of this, which is the last issue, which is about monitoring and pushing for effective measures, is that many of the tax havens lists are under political influence. So there's a reason why some jurisdictions are in one list and not in the other ones. And then there's also the issue that once you have a list, it's very clear and you have very specific requirements as to be in this list, it's very easy as to in a way, try to find the way to get out of the list. That's what happened with the OECD and that list about how many jurisdictions had at least 12 exchange of information agreements. And then it was very easy for many jurisdictions, especially those traditional tax havens, just to start signing bilateral treaties among themselves so as a way to stop being part of these lists. So in contrast to that, what we do is we have the spectrum and degree, and what it allows us is to be not only objective and verifiable, and that's what you will see also, but it can also serve as a way to measure. So as we do this every 2 years, then we can compare how well jurisdictions are doing in terms of transparency and how, in other cases, just going towards more opacity. So just a few facts about the Financial Secrecy Index. It's published by the Tax Justice Network. What we do is identify and rank secrecy jurisdictions by their contribution to opacity in international finance. We define, just very briefly, a secrecy jurisdiction as a jurisdiction which provides facilities that enable people or entities to escape or undermine the laws, rules, and regulations of other jurisdictions elsewhere using secrecy as a prime tool. So again, it's a long-term project. It started in 2009 with covering 60 jurisdictions. The last one, which was published on November 2013, last year, covered 82 jurisdictions, and the idea is just to keep on including, as our resources allow us to do it, just many more jurisdictions and hopefully just cover all the jurisdictions in the world. And the two goals are, well, on the one hand, just researching on data and analyzing all these illicit financial flows, but at the same time, just bringing this issue to the public, just generating debates and having lay people understand what the big issues are, because if not, sometimes it just gets very complicated for regular people who don't really understand much of tax laws, how this whole system works. So, going to the FSA structure. The way it's structured, and that's, I would say, maybe the most innovative part of it, and that's why it explains how we can identify most OECD countries and most of major economies, is that on the one hand, we have a secrecy score that is financial secrecy on offer for non-residents. So basically, the secrecy, in many ways that we will see in just a second, And that's maybe what traditional tax lists aim at. So it's saying, okay, how secretive, those who not only aim at tax provisions but also at secrecy, how secretive a jurisdiction is. On the other hand, what we combine the secrecy score with is a global scale weight. This basically is the market share for cross-border financial services. So basically, it's the market share of every jurisdiction in terms of financial services for non-residents. The reason for this is that, and I'll just get to that very soon, is that if we only focus on secrecy, on the secrecy score, so how non-transparent a jurisdiction is, then we might be identifying jurisdictions which are extremely secrecy, but still that no one really cares about or no one really goes to. So even if, and the reason again, we're trying to tackle this and solve this. So if all the resources of the world or even policy would just be at addressing these very small cases of very secretive jurisdictions where maybe only 10 people or 1,000 people go, then we wouldn't really be solving anything. So in many cases, there are major jurisdictions such as the US and the UK, as we will see now, or even Germany and Japan, which might not be as secretive as other Palm Islands in the Pacific or in the Caribbean, but still having such a huge market share of financial services, they have a much bigger responsibility in terms of transparency, because just a tiny loophole there, just a tiny provision, that entails that a huge consequence for financial flows elsewhere and in the world. So that's why we combine these two values so as to get an FSI value. So the secrecy score is composed of 15 equally weighted key financial secrecy indicators. I will go into them right now. They're fully referenced to public data. This is all public. You can just log into internet and just see this for every jurisdiction. There's almost 50 variables that feed these KFSIs, but again, for every jurisdiction, we have more than 200 variables. So even though not all of them go part of this ranking, they're still in case anyone is doing any research or would like to get more information, you can just search, and there's, again, about more than 200 variables that we look into. And now a very important aspect is the last point, which is the lowest available transparency denominator. What this means is that even if a jurisdiction may require transparency for most companies, but then there is one specific case of companies that doesn't require any transparency whatsoever, then it's very likely that anyone trying to hide their assets or just try to hide their crimes would go and use that specific case of company. So as a way to make sure that all jurisdictions comply in all kinds of transparency, we always use the lowest available denominator. So whether a jurisdiction for 90% of the companies requires transparency, but for 1% doesn't, then we would still award that company that jurisdiction a zero transparency credit. And then the global scale weight, as I just explained, it's just the market share in the sum of all world exports of financial services for non-residents, and that's how it's measured. It's based on, I'm a lawyer, so I worked basically on the secrecy score, which is analyzing the legal framework just from different reports like Global Forum peer review reports, IMF assessments, INCSRs, FATF evaluations. But then there is also some economists doing all the econometrics, and it's also based on a paper by Zorame from the IMF, who first started to analyze this issue about export of financial services for non-residents. Okay, so that was just the FSA, just understanding the objectives, and now going into the results and the political context. So, just this to clarify, these are actual results of the 2013 results, and this is to understand what we are saying between the comparison between the FSI, what we do, anything that would only focus on the secrecy score, and then in the end, the global scale weight, which is, again, just looking into the major jurisdictions in terms of financial market. So if you look at the column on the middle, which is red, and obviously already has a cross as being like bad, that will be only looking at the secrecy score. So if you look at the 10 top jurisdictions in terms of secrecy score, we have Samoa, Vanuatu, Seychelles, St. Lucia, Brunei, Liberia, Marshall Islands, Barbados, Belize, and San Marino. So again, if you look at almost the second last row, which is average of secrecy score, the average is 83, so that means a very high number in terms of secrecy. However, if you look at the sum of the global scale weight, it's only 0.1%. So again, this explains is that if all the resources of the world, or in terms of policy, would be addressed at these 10 top secrecy jurisdictions, we would only be covering 0.1% of the market share. So again, it wouldn't really have any change in the world. It wouldn't be effective at all. The last column only looks at financial services, so that has nothing to do with secrecy. And then when you look at the FSI, that is the combination of both the secrecy score and the global scale weight. So it's basically looking at the major jurisdictions and seeing how secretive they are. So that's why Switzerland is on the top of the FSI for the second time. Then we have Luxembourg, Hong Kong, Cayman Islands, Singapore, USA, Lebanon, Germany, Jersey, and Japan. So in this case, the average of secrecy score is 69, so it's a bit lower than the top jurisdictions only looking at the secrecy score. But in this case, we are considering 60% of the global scale weight. So about 60% of financial services for non-residents would be covered here. And again, the FSI is a ranking of the 82 jurisdictions. I'm just pointing here at the top 10. But again, if you look at the webpage, you can just see the whole ranking. And just going on again, this is just the three columns were just these three dots, which are either the one which shows top 10 FSI jurisdictions by scale, by global scale weight. On the other side, it's the top 10 by secrecy, and that's, you see that they're very secretive, but still they're extremely low, almost 0% in terms of global scale weight. On the blue, you have most of other tax havens lists, which again, they tend to cover somewhere in between secrecy scores, but they don't really go very high in terms of the global scale weight. So again, they are addressing and they're looking, obviously for political reasons, it's much easier for an organization like the OECD, which is basically a club of rich countries, to always aim and blame smaller jurisdictions instead of actually taking responsibility and trying to change things. Then, just for most of you, I'm sure you're aware of the Global Forum, which is this organization, which is also related to the OECD, in charge of monitoring and assessing the peer reviews in terms of transparency for bank secrecy and access of information for exchange of the information. And even though they have been doing and conducting these peer reviews for some time, only in November of last year, they actually gave this assessment, this evaluation of all the jurisdictions they have been covering. And even though the FSI and the Global Forum do not look exactly at the same things, this is just a graphic show. Again, this is just an example of British Crown dependencies and overseas territories. So when the Global Forum considers that most of it is green or yellow, which means largely compliant, we see that we find that it's actually more in terms of red or orange, being like almost non-compliant in terms of transparency, at least for those first three issues which are very related to the Global Forum full assessment. Another way of seeing it is that here we are comparing the top 21 jurisdictions according to the FSI and then what the assessment were by the Global Forum. So what we would expect is that if these are the top 21 jurisdictions according to the FSI, that all of them should be either rated non-compliant or partially compliant. So they should all be either red or yellow or orange. In contrast to that, most of them are yellow, and again, yellow here means largely compliant. So according to the Global Forum, which is again this OECD-backed organization, they find that almost there's no such thing as a very big problem in terms of transparency. Just another way of looking at it is that what happens according to the ones, and this is just another way of seeing it, the top, all the ones who are rated non-compliant by the Global Forum, and then you see that they only cover maybe 6 of those from the top 25 jurisdictions of the FSI, but then many of those refer to the ones which are on the bottom. So that means, in many cases, even if we really try and address the limited resources just to address those jurisdictions, we wouldn't really be covering many of the relevant ones, and we wouldn't really be changing much of the world in terms of that. These are the FSI 2013 results. So here you have the top 21 jurisdictions. And these flags over there show that if the UK were taken together with all the crown dependencies and overseas territories, then the UK would be by far the top of the FSI. But having it differently, then, well, the UK is number 21, and you have cases like Cayman Islands being number 4, and in this case, Switzerland is still on the top, but just to show how much of a responsibility the UK and its dependencies have in all this financial secrecy system. Okay, and now I guess it's going specifically to the detailed assessment. So the secrecy score is composed of these 15 financial secrecy indicators. The first one is about knowledge of beneficial ownership. So here we look into bank secrecy, trust and foundations registers, and recorded company ownership. Then we have key aspects of corporate transparency regulation. So here we have public company ownership. In this case, it's whether it's publicly available on internet and just can be accessed by anyone. The same for accounts. And then cases by country reporting, whether countries or jurisdictions are actually engaging in this or not. Then we look into efficiency of tax and financial regulation, if they are fit for information exchange, according to the information they are seeking, the efficiency of the tax administration, whether they avoid promoting tax evasion, whether they have harmful legal vehicles. And then the last one is about international standards and cooperation, just looking into how their anti-money laundering ratings are, whether they are engaging in automatic information exchange, and then, well, bilateral treaties and some international commitments. So the idea now is to explain each specific KFSI, each specific indicator, what we're looking into, and then just compare where each jurisdiction stands in this case. So the first one is bank secrecy. So here we look into whether bank secrecy has a legal standing in a jurisdiction, whether anonymous accounts are available, so whether beneficial ownership registration is required or not, or if anyone can just have numbered accounts or just, I don't know, have any fictitious name as a bank account holder. Whether jurisdictions have the obligation to keep bank records for at least 5 years, and that's obviously so in case of there is exchange of information, then you could actually access that, because obviously for any investigation you need to go and look into the past to see what has been going on. Then if there is large transactions reporting, and if they have to be maintained over time. And then very importantly, and this is what the Global Forum peer reviews look into, and that's what we not always agree with, but so sometimes we just assess it differently, is whether it's access to information. And this means whether authorities have the power to obtain and provide information without extra requirements, such as a court order. Because again, if any jurisdiction makes a request of information according to the old standard, which is still the current standard until this new automatic information exchange, it's so complicated many times. So if there is not only sending the information and the request, just fulfilling all the requirements, if then someone has to authorize it and then a court has to go and approve it and only then they will go and seek the information, there's sometimes way too much time and way too many options just to avoid any exchange of information whatsoever. And then the last one is that there is no undue notification and appeal rights. And that means whether the taxpayer has to be notified about an investigation going on, and then if they have either any appeal rights, which would either postpone the exchange of information or even avoid it on the whole. And there are many jurisdictions actually doing this. Some like Uruguay maybe don't have any exceptions to the notification, so they will always do it. Cases like Switzerland, they even give the taxpayer the actual request. So the request by another jurisdiction, which explains specifically why they are looking into this person, the taxpayer in Switzerland would actually get access to that information. And these are just some news examples about Switzerland, which obviously is one of the most well-known in terms of bank secrecy, just against India not sharing information, and then also Swiss courts blocking Julius Baer trying to exchange and transfer information to the US. Now, just going to specifically the rankings, these are the top 5 secrecy scores. So we have, for instance, Marshall Islands, and the reason why it has only 0.2% of secrecy score is because they have a domestic interest requirement. So unless there is a domestic interest requirement, authorities cannot actually gain access to information. So if it were only an interest of a foreign jurisdiction, then the authorities would have no access. At the same time, there is no access, well, actually in this case, it's not no access at all for exchange of information. We have St. Kitts, where there is a court order needed to access information in some cases, and there is no customer due diligence. We have Ghana, Brunei, which again, there's court order necessary and no customer due diligence. Then if we look at examples of somewhere in between, so it's not the top in terms of secrecy, but it's also not the bottom, which is a bit more transparent. We have Luxembourg, which there's only access to information for EOI, but only in 28 of the 68 treaties they have. Something very similar happens in Switzerland, where there is no access of information for more than 50% of the exchange of information agreements. It's only for DTA, and well, Switzerland actually has many requirements, which on the surface, it might look like, oh, yeah, there is no such thing as bank secrecy, but then when you go and look into all the specific requirements, then you see that it's actually quite complicated to get the information, and that has been the case, at least for Argentina. For instance, just another example is the Isle of Man that has some appeal rights to oppose EOI, and then there is partial compliance with customer due diligence. And then looking into, I mean, this again is just to show an example of what more transparency means. We have Jersey, where bank secrecy has no statutory basis, but there are still some restrictions, specifically in terms of sharing the information with Guernsey, or the BBI, which has partially compliant with FATF customer due diligence recommendations. So again, this is just an assessment about how easy it is to get this information, but still, industry is always running faster than any regulation, and so this is a news article by The Economist from November of last year, just these Uber warehouses for the ultra-rich, and this is actually ads of being offered in private free ports and private airports in Luxembourg, and I think it's also the case in Singapore, which is again catered at the ultra-wealthy, and it's basically some warehouses for ultra-rich in these special economic zones or these duty-free zones where there's almost very little control whatsoever or supervision, and so people could just go and hide their assets over there, and that's why even if banks start sharing a bit more information, even though not absolutely, then there's still a way to evade and avoid any kind of sharing of information just by going into these kinds of deposits. Then going into the Trust and Foundations Register, that's KFSI number 2. Here we look whether there's this is about private foundations, not about charity ones, which are much more regulated. So we look into whether there's a local incorporation law, so if it's possible to create these private foundations. And if yes, then whether there's any registration required and if the information is available. And in the case of trusts, it's almost the same, but also we look into the possibility of, even if there is no incorporation of foreign trust, they might be recognized, and a resident could be a trustee for a foreign incorporated trust. And then we also look whether there's any kind of registration required and whether there's any publication of this information just being publicly available. And that's just another example of, I guess we were discussing about this yesterday, just Jersey having these brochures catering to Russia now with all these new sanctions, and again, for all the very reasons of trust being one of these major used entities in terms of, and for the reason of hiding behind them and just lack of transparency. And the same happens with the City of London. So again, this is just to show that in many cases we do look into major countries and not just the typical and traditional tax havens. Some examples of the top secrecy scores: we have Bahamas, where there's a domestic trust law, and there's also administration of foreign trust law, and no registry whatsoever, no registration whatsoever. We have Germany, which has domestic trust law and administration, both without registration, but there is some registration requirement for private foundations. Then we have those in the middle. We have Luxembourg again, with some domestic trust law and administration of foreign trusts without registration, and some registration requirements for foundations. The USA, which almost has the same case. And then if we go into those jurisdictions which are a bit more transparent in terms of these, we have Brazil, where there is no domestic trust law, even though they could be administered from there, those which are foreign, but there is no private foundations allowed to be created there. And the same would happen with Spain. The third KFSI is about recorded company ownership. So here what we look into is for limited liability companies, so not those which are listed on a stock exchange, because in that case there are more transparency requirements, is whether there is an obligation to submit and update beneficial ownership information. And by beneficial ownership, we mean not the first layer, which is owning, but actually the ultimate beneficial owner, so the natural person who is actually in charge, either owning or controlling in practice the shares or actually the company. So in order to get the full credit, each jurisdiction would have to require the full name of the beneficial owner and the country of residence, and then either some identification such as the passport number or date of birth or the tax identification number. And again, this would consider that there are no bear shares allowed, or even if they are, then they have to be registered or immobilized. This is quite sad, but it's again quite obvious, and we have been discussing about this, I guess, in yesterday's session. these are all jurisdictions. So far, there is no jurisdiction which actually offers a registry of beneficial ownership, so this is not the case yet. However, there are some attempts to change that, so there are some news about the EU starting to require this for most entities, again with this question about what's going to happen with trusts because of the UK, and then some crown dependencies having these action plans and these consultancy processes where people can just give their opinion and see whether beneficial ownership will take place or not. So unfortunately, this is one of the most important cases which feeds, for instance, exchange for information or automatic information exchange, but still it's not the case in any part of the world. So even though beneficial ownership information is not yet part, we do look whether for those limited liability companies, or so anyone with limited liability, that according to the GF reports has the obligation to register and to update the information, at least for legal ownership, we look into whether this information is available at the commercial registries web pages. So for those jurisdictions which actually the assessment is that they do have to provide this, we then go into the web page and we actually try to buy, because not only the information has to be there and published, but we check whether, again, the information contains the full name on either the address or passport number or some other way of identification. The results here are that, well, there's not, again, most of countries do not either do this. Again, they might do it for some type of company, but not for all the limited liability companies. So in most cases, they have like a zero score here, because, and even if they do, maybe the registry just doesn't provide any information online, or you just have to be there. I think it's one of the cases in Bermuda or Bahamas where you have to be there so as to request information, or it might be extremely expensive, and that's why it also would be unavailable for most people. But then the ones which are actually in a way more transparent, well, there's only these very few ones. I think it's about 8. And again, there's only legal ownership which is available online, but in that case, it is actually quite easy. New Zealand actually has one of the best registries. You don't even need to register, you just go online, just type any name of the company, and then you can see who actually owns it. The same goes for public company accounts. So we look whether, for those jurisdictions that have to keep underlying documents of accounts and maintain them for at least 5 years, and that have to submit accounts to authorities, we look whether these company accounts are available online, either for free or again up to $10 US, which just seems reasonable. In this case, again, most jurisdictions that we have covered don't have any requirement to send these accounts whatsoever, but there are some of them, in this case it's 12, where information is actually available. Then we have country-by-country reporting, and here we look whether all companies, or at least some sectors like the banking or the extractive industries, are required to submit either all or some financial reporting data on country-by-country basis. And in case they do have to, we look whether how regularly this is done, either one-off, like the case of Hong Kong for some listed companies, or if it's actually done annually. Well, this basically has some major consequences for multinational companies. Again, if they only provide what's happening in that specific jurisdiction, and this happens, and this is the case for most developing countries, where the tax authorities are not really that sophisticated or do not have the staff or training to actually look and understand how the whole accounting of these companies goes, then they are unable just to tax almost anything. And many cases, if country by country were provided, and then all these tax authorities could look into what is going on in the rest of the world and where all these taxes and profits are being shifted, then they could maybe assess and reassess and understand how much tax they should actually be paying. Most countries, again, unfortunately, do not have any country-by-country reporting whatsoever, but there is the case of Hong Kong, which is just one of time. There is the case of the US, which has partial disclosure in either extractive or banking sector in some cases. And then for most countries in the European Union, for the European Union, there has been some legislation changes, and now for the banking and extractive industries, they will be required to start providing some country-by-country reporting. So that's why all of the European Union jurisdictions have a 0.5 transparency score. Then we also look whether jurisdictions are fit for information exchange, and here we ask whether, or we analyze whether Resident-paying agents, such as joint stock companies and financial institutions, are required to report to the domestic tax administration information on all payments, so basically dividends and interest, to all non-residents. And this is very important because in case any other jurisdiction tries to obtain this information, and obviously for their own purposes, if this information is not already being collected, then it's much harder to actually get the information and actually share it. They might not even have they might not even be requested or required to do it. So for those that actually do it, then it does help and enable exchange of information. Here, most countries, again, do not have any of these requirements whatsoever, but there are specific cases of South Africa, Latvia, and Netherlands, which have a requirement for dividend payments only, that they have to provide this information to tax authorities. And then just those on the top, which many are from the EU, they do require for both dividend and interest payments to be reporting to authorities. Then we look at the efficiency of tax administration, whether they have a unit for large taxpayers, and whether there is a use of tax identifiers for matching info reported on both interest and dividends. Here, unfortunately, most jurisdictions do not have any of these identification of taxpayers' identification just to match both payments. But there are some cases, for instance, Singapore, that has at least a large taxpayer unit. Cyprus, that has a taxpayer identifier for both dividend and interest payments, but no large taxpayer unit. And then some other cases, the USA, and well, all the ones that you see on the bottom, which do comply with all these three requirements, and that's why they do get a full transparency score in this KFSI. Okay, then number 9 is about promoting tax evasion, avoids promoting tax evasion, and here the bottom line is whether a jurisdiction offers a credit system for the tax paid abroad, and on the contrary, whether a jurisdiction exempts foreign income just either by having a territorial tax system, an exemption for interest or dividends, offering these international companies which are only allowed to engage in businesses with non-residents and nothing to do with the jurisdiction where they are incorporated, where there are different rules, like the case of the US, or just if there is no tax whatsoever. So the ones which you can see by the red, those engaging in all these cases of exempting foreign income, then the case is basically that it's pushing for this lowering this competition to the bottom of just every jurisdiction offering more of these businesses-friendly provisions of no tax whatsoever, and that really has a really bad consequence for the revenues of most developing countries. On the contrary, if a jurisdiction offers this credit system for foreign tax paid, obviously abroad, then for a company, it would be the same actually where it is incorporated and where it pays taxes, because then it would get this credit back. So that's why we analyze this in this KFSI. Most jurisdictions, again, unfortunately, do not provide any of this credit system. Some of them here, these are the ones in yellow or orange, that maybe provide either for natural persons or for one of the related or unrelated or independent parties, but not for all cases, and then only the ones who offer these for credit systems a credit system for dividends and interest in all scenarios, so that's for natural persons, and then entities either related and unrelated, well, it's those which are here on the bottom, which unfortunately are not very many. Well, these are just some more cases about, some more news about, but well, I mean, I guess I'm running short of time, so I'll just keep on going. So on number 10, we look whether a jurisdiction offers harmful legal vehicles, so basically whether protected style companies are allowed to be incorporated in the jurisdiction, or whether trusts which have flea clauses are prohibited. These flea clauses are defined here is a provision included in a tax haven or secrecy jurisdiction trust deeds, requiring that the management and administration of a trust be changed to a different jurisdiction if a disadvantageous event occurs, such as the breakdown of law and order in the place, or the imposition of taxation of the trust, or even if there is any kind of investigation underway against that trust. So again, jurisdictions should prohibit both cases. They shouldn't allow these protected cell companies, which were originated in Guernsey, specifically for the insurance companies, but now are used as a way to just provide more secrecy, because once you go into the first company, it's very complicated, and it's very easy for them just to migrate somewhere else and just take the funds when you're trying to reach the actual owner. And the other case is, again, these flea clauses in trusts, which just provides that any service provider would just be obliged to change and either close the trust or just migrate it somewhere else. And since many jurisdictions do not register or have any legislation on trust whatsoever, then it's almost impossible for all of them to have any prohibition on flea clauses. And that's what's being demonstrated in this KFSI. So these are the ones that either have cell companies or do not prohibit flea clauses. Then many of them, these are just examples of those that at least prohibit formation of cell companies. And then, and then there's none of the other ones. I mean, there's only examples of these two. There's no jurisdiction actually either both prohibiting cell companies and also prohibiting these flea clauses. Now, what's very interesting here and very relevant is about anti-money laundering. So here we look at the overall compliance and rating by the FATF that has done in the evaluations about all the 40 recommendations. Well, I'm sure most of you know already what these recommendations are about, but it's about terrorism financing, whether there is beneficial ownership, whether there is customer due diligence for banks and entities where their registries have to have any information, whether there is international cooperation, so whether a jurisdiction has or is part of international commitments in terms of sharing information. And this is actually quite sad, because this is an example. This is a graph I took from OECD source, which is measuring OECD in terms of illicit financial flows from developing countries. And again, coming from a developing country like Argentina, which in many cases you would expect it to be at least less sophisticated and with less training, you would expect many of these major OECD countries, who again are those where most of these illicit financial flows are deposited, to be quite compliant in terms of money laundering. But here what you see, again, all these dots should be ideally green or if not yellow, but there's so much red and orange over there, just showing that even the major OECD countries are so non-compliant and are so behind any acceptable compliance with FATF recommendations, and that's something. And again, if this is the way just to measure whether banks and entities and a jurisdiction in the whole is preventing money laundering, well, here we see the result, which explains many of the news and again, the system that goes on. So just as an example, those which are complying with at least with less than 50%, we have Seychelles and Luxembourg and Bermuda. Those which are between the 50 and 75% of compliance with FATF recommendations are all the ones, again, these are some examples, but are all the ones here in yellow. We have Cayman Islands and Singapore, and only one of them complying with at least 75%, and that's the case of Guernsey. But again, there's no one actually complying with the whole 40 recommendations or 49 recommendations. Then this is a KFSI about automatic information exchange. This will actually change because of the new advances, I would say, in terms of FATCA and the OECD CRS standard, which is this common reporting standard on automatic information exchange. Here, the idea was to look whether there's any participation in a multilateral automatic information exchange. So basically, the only one covered back then was the EUSTD, the European Union Savings and Tax Directive, where jurisdictions could choose whether to share information automatically or to withhold taxes, like the case of Austria and Luxembourg at the beginning. But again, this KFSI will change, and we will incorporate this new information for the next FSI, which will be launched on 2015. We also look here about the amount of tax information exchange treaties that are signed of a jurisdiction. And here we look whether the agreement, either a DTA, a double tax avoidance agreement, or a TIEA, a tax information exchange agreement, is in force, and whether, according to the Global Forum, whether it meets the international standards. So, in order to assess this, they do not only look at the actual text of the treaty, but they actually also look at the domestic legal framework of both jurisdictions involved. So if one of them doesn't comply with the standard because, for instance, there's no access of information, even if the treaty itself and the text seems to be compliant, well, then the jurisdiction, I mean, that treaty is not considered to be compliant, and that's what the OECD, the Global Forum, assesses, and that's what we measure here. We count actually how many of them, and we see how many of them have as many information as the average of G20 countries, because again, if these are major financial centers, then we expect them to have the same relevance in terms of financial services. So we would like to see how many of them actually have, at least with the average of G20 countries, the same amount of treaties so as to exchange information with all the relevant countries. So we have, well, the case of Switzerland, which is really bad, and then some other cases which are Costa Rica or the US Virgin Islands, which have as many EOI-compliant treaties as the average of G20 countries. The rest is just done proportionately according to how many they do. And then there's just two more, just these two last KFSIs. One is international transparency commitments. So here we look whether each jurisdiction is part or has ratified these 5 international conventions. So the OECD Convention on Mutual Administrative Assistance in Tax Matters, the Convention Against Corruption, the Convention Against basically the Drug Convention, Convention on Financing of Terrorism, and then the one about transnational organized crime. Because many of these have transparency commitments in terms of sharing information, and that's why we actually look into how many jurisdictions actually have ratified all of them. So 1 or 2, we have Bermuda or Cayman Islands. Just some more, we have Switzerland or Hong Kong or Isle of Man, and then some cases where they have ratified all the relevant ones. We have Costa Rica or the UK, or yeah, and then some others, but there wasn't enough room for all of them. And then the last one, we look again into some of the FATF recommendations in terms of judicial cooperation. And well, these are 4 recommendations. It's the mutual legal assistance. It's about expeditious action in response to requests by foreign countries to identify, freeze, seize, and confiscate property laundered. Money laundering as an extraditable offense, and then the widest possible range of international cooperation to their foreign counterparts. So we look how compliant they are with all these 4 recommendations, or these actually 5. So again, that's how the secrecy score is formed, is created, and that's what is ranked. But as I was explaining to you, and this is fed by 50 variables, but then for each jurisdiction, and again, this you can just access Financial Secrecy Index, Google that, and you will get the web page. For each of the 82 jurisdictions, we have one of these reports. Obviously, you're not expected to read everything, and this doesn't even include the notes and the references. But just for you to get an idea of all the information that we try to recover about each jurisdiction, so the GDP composition and employment composition, so as to see how relevant the services is, how many international affiliations they have, whether they have been blacklisted in any of these traditional tax havens lists, details about the tax system, about financial regulators, whether they are independent or not, or whether there is this revolving door, and how they're measured by how they are assessed by the IMF. Bank secrecy, companies and trusts and foundations and partnerships, again, just going into much more detail about whether directors are allowed, whether they have to be resident or not, how many, whether nominees are allowed, whether they can be companies or have to be natural persons. And again, there is just a lot of information that we expect to cover, and everything is referenced so that anyone just challenging this could just go and look at the source and then, well, find there. We do this, again, by looking into most of the Global Forum peer review reports, IMF assessments, INCSRs, FATF, and also we send service to all jurisdictions, Ministry of Finance and the Financial Intelligence Unit, so as to get information from them. And then we also consult with tax experts and legal experts of these domestic jurisdictions, so as to know if there's some actual thing going on in practice that is not doesn't appear in any of these reports. So the conclusion is just the importance of major players, cleaning house, so basically the UK, the USA, and Germany, and it's not only the small. That's the limited benefits from squeezing the usual suspects, so that's the smaller jurisdictions and the poor countries, just like the Corruption Perception Index addresses. And what we really care about, and that's something that also looks into this new project I'm working on automatic information exchange, is whether this actually benefits developing countries or not. And well, the next steps is just to keep on working for beneficial ownership registration for all entities, automatic exchange for information in a way that it's effective, and then, well, country-by-country reporting also for all cases of companies. So, well, thank you very much, and I'll have some minutes left for some questions or comments in case there are any. Yeah?
Hi. I know that you're a lawyer, so I'll excuse myself for the comments that I'm going to make. I'm still waiting for the opportunity to sit with the economists behind your analysis. And I say that because if I had done this in I am an economist by training, master in finance, banking, happen to be from your country too, originally, which is irrelevant. But the reality is, if I had done this study in my university in Argentina in my first year, I would not have my degree and I wouldn't be here. Because this study doesn't hold any water from an econometrics perspective. There's no explanation, scientific explanation, for grabbing a qualitative measure, a quantitative measure, elevate one at the third, do the square third or whatever you call it of the other one, and multiply the two. That's reverse engineering. There's no explanation to that other than you end up with the list that you want to end up with, which shows the 10 countries you are expecting. And then you conclude that the UK plus the Crown dependencies are responsible for all of it, or would be number one. And there's something that you probably learned in your first week of econometrics, which is correlation doesn't mean causality. The reason why you have those countries as the biggest flows of financial, biggest players in financial flows is because, like it or not, UK law is the global standard, is the best recognized law in the world. And that's the only reason this place exists. Has nothing to do with tax. So again, that's an econometric question or discussion that I look forward having with the right person. You're going to tell me that, before you tell me if you're going to tell me that the methodology is on the website, I can assure everybody, I went to the website. After you dig in, you find a link that sends you to a 200-page document. I went through the 200 pages. In page about 180-something, you find another link to another 200-page document. I don't need to tell you what happens after you've gone through the 400 pages. There's nothing there. So I would be very interested in having your econometric sit with another econometric and have this discussion in public, because this is not fair and it's not a neutral assessment. I also can comment on your legal side. Again, I don't think we have time or it makes a lot of sense, but it doesn't also make any scientific justification to, for example, rate 0 countries that don't do tax credit, when a country that doesn't have direct taxation by definition cannot have a tax credit. Therefore, you're putting 0 rating on countries but by definition cannot have those tax credits. So we all understand what you're trying to do. It would be better if it's done in a better scientific way. Thank you.
Just to answer that, again, I mean, since I'm not an economist, I might not go into the details, and actually I can then show you where specifically the information is, because that is there. It's not just a reference to a reference. And again, many of the things that we face in terms of how complicated it is to actually assess this is because there is no so much transparency. There is no such publicly available transparency about how many financial services each jurisdiction actually affords and offers. So many cases, I mean, this is done, the basis of that is actually based on Zorme, which is from the IMF, and I can refer to that and show you. I'm pretty sure that maybe you have already looked at it. And again, the objective here is, given the lack of transparency and the lack of information available in the world, I would say in many of these respects, it's not easy just to assess this, and this is obviously the best so far we have been able to do. But as a lawyer, I mean, you can, this is based, most of the cases, I mean, I would say 99% of the cases, it's based on IMF reports or GF reports about the legal framework on those cases. And many here just already know about all the structures and in terms of trusts and companies and no beneficial ownership and no access to information being exchanged. So that's the secrecy score. And then just, even if you maybe disagree or maybe do not, maybe, yeah, okay, just disagree with the methodology, just trying to say that the UK, the US, or Hong Kong, or Cayman Islands, or BVI, we just got, according to the last report, being one of the fourth countries in terms of foreign direct investment. So, I mean, even if you could, in a methodological way, not agree with everything, and I could accept that, just, I wouldn't say that this whole project and this whole research, which combines the importance in terms of financial secrecy, and again, most of these jurisdictions already name themselves as financial centers, and I think the Cayman Islands does it too, BVI. So just, and what we try to do is basically, if we only look at the legal framework, that's what already most of the OECD and most of political organizations are doing, just blaming the little ones that do not really have a much responsibility in terms of the global financial market. So if we only aim at them, again, it's only 0.1%. And even if you don't agree with 0.1%, if we only go to Vanuatu and Samoa and some islands that maybe no one uses because they're either far or there's no legal stability, then again, we wouldn't be changing much. But many of these, again, I'm pretty sure you will not at least challenge that no jurisdiction whatsoever has a real beneficial ownership registration. And many of them do not yet engage in multilateral automatic information exchange. So if you have many of these financial centers which do receive, even if you don't agree with the exact numbers or the exact comparison of how the ratio is done, that they do receive funds from, I can assure you from Argentina, just like speaking with people here that they have confirmed that, of reports about Argentines and people from Africa and Latin America having their funds and their secret funds, and many of the politicians actually having that in all these financial centers and having no secrecy. Even if you don't agree specifically with the methodology, I don't think you can just fairly say that we're just trying to, I mean, ideally point at some people. It's, again, looking at the financial secrecy, it's looking at the legal framework in terms of the lack of transparency that they offer, and then also knowing and trying to measure as, again, given the available information, this is done, the basis of that is the IMF information that I can show you later, or refer to you later, and that combines the two things. So even if you don't agree specifically, I don't think anyone here could just challenge the fact that many of these jurisdictions appearing here are major financial centers. They even call themselves major financial centers. And then when you combine that with all the transparency that they don't have, that's how we come up with these jurisdictions. So I hope that, in a way, I'm sorry for the passionate about the response, address your comment. Thank you very much. I don't know if there are any other questions or comments. Yeah. Again, I'm not an economist, so I do believe, I mean, if it's only from Argentina that $200 billion are being offshore, are held offshore, and again, Argentina is not really one of the richest countries in the world, having, of all the countries in the world, that number, I'm saying it could be. But even if it's not 23, if it's 20 or 15, that's still such a large amount. So again, here we're dealing with jurisdictions which are financial centers, which allow illicit financial flows from corruption, bribery, drugs, money laundering, and also just tax evasion. So even if you don't agree specifically with that number, I mean, I don't think how it's specifically relevant in terms of this whole system that I don't think anyone can challenge about that has problems, and that there are many people using this lack of transparency in terms of entities so as to, again, keep on doing all these corrupt crimes and also not pay any taxes. So again, I do agree, but even if you don't, I don't think the exact figure is that relevant. I mean, I don't even understand what 23 or 20 trillion is. I think it's such a large number that even if it only were 1 trillion, I would say it's just as bad, or even 1 billion would be just as bad. I don't know, I mean, I'm I know there's another session starting, so I don't know if there's anyone with any other question, or if not, okay, well, thank you very much.